At the heart of this tragic narrative were two individuals whose lives became intricately entwined. Evelyn Gosling, a 34-year-old English professor at Briarcliff Community College, was renowned for her exceptional intellect and engaging lectures. Zay Holloway, a freshman struggling to find his footing but dreaming of becoming a writer, was inexorably drawn to her radiant presence. What began as a mentorship gradually morphed into a tangled web of manipulation, longing, and ultimately, murder. As investigators delved into their relationship, they unearthed a dark saga of exploitation, obsession, twisted fantasies, and lethal desperation. Evelyn Gosling's path to Briarcliff was marked by academic triumphs and personal strife. Born into wealth in Boston, Evelyn exhibited signs of remarkable intelligence from an early age. Her father, a stern investment banker, and her mother, a socialite with a fondness for cocktails, provided Evelyn with every material advantage but scant emotional support. From a young age, Evelyn learned to wield her intellect as a shield, immersing herself in books to escape the cold reality of her home life. She excelled academically, skipping 2 grades and entering Harvard, where she discovered her passion for English literature and her talent for captivating an audience. After earning her Ph.D. at Yale, Evelyn seemed destined for a prestigious position at an Ivy League institution. However, a scandal involving an affair with her married thesis advisor derailed those plans. The academic community's whispered judgments and thinly veiled rejection drove Evelyn to seek refuge in the small town of Briarcliff. At Briarcliff Community College, Evelyn swiftly established herself as a rising star. Her lectures on Renaissance literature and modern poetry attracted students from other departments, and her innovative teaching methods earned her the admiration of both colleagues and students alike. Dr. Gosling embodied success, brilliant, beautiful, and dedicated to her craft. Yet beneath her polished exterior lay a woman haunted by her past and driven by an insatiable need for validation. Evelyn's relationships were often intense but fleeting, leaving her feeling empty and misunderstood. She craved the adoration of her students, basking in their admiration and subtly fostering their dependence on her guidance. A psychological evaluation conducted post-arrest would later reveal a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic traits and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. It was this volatile mix of intelligence, charisma, and unresolved emotional issues that paved the way for her fateful encounter with Zay Holloway. In him, Evelyn saw not just another student to mentor, but a chance to recapture the youth and passion she felt slipping away. Zay Holloway's journey to Briarcliff Community College was anything but conventional. Born into a working-class family, Zay was the youngest of 4 children in a household that struggled to make ends meet. His father, a construction worker, spent long hours on job sites, while his mother juggled multiple part-time jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Zay found solace in the world of books. While his siblings excelled in sports and practical skills, Zay was the family dreamer. He was often found scribbling stories in worn notebooks or lost in the pages of well-read paperbacks borrowed from the local library. Zay's high school years were marked by academic inconsistency. He shone in subjects that sparked his imagination, like English and history, but struggled with the rigid structures of math and science. His guidance counselor, Ms. Ramirez, recalled that Zay had a spark of genius when it came to writing, but he lacked the discipline and confidence to truly excel. Despite his potential, Zay's grades were mediocre, and his SAT scores fell short of his aspirations. The rejection letters from his dream colleges were a bitter pill to swallow. Beneath Zay's artistic temperament lay a young man grappling with self-doubt and a desperate need for validation. It was this combination of raw talent, emotional vulnerability, and a burning desire to prove himself that made Zay the perfect target for Evelyn Gosling's manipulation. In Evelyn, Zay saw more than just a mentor. He saw a doorway into the intellectual and artistic realm he yearned to enter. As the fall semester commenced, Zay could never have foreseen that his quest for literary greatness would lead him down a sinister path of ethical compromises, emotional entanglement, and ultimately to the banks of Lake Briarcliff, where his young life would meet a tragic end. The inaugural day of the advanced composition class marked a pivotal moment in both Evelyn and Zay's lives, though neither could have anticipated the tragic trajectory their paths would take. Evelyn, impeccably attired in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, commanded the room with her presence. Her gaze swept across the sea of new faces, pausing briefly on Zay, slouched in the back row, nervously fidgeting with his pen. As Evelyn delved into her introductory lecture on the power of narrative, Zay found himself enthralled. Her words seemed to resonate deeply within him, igniting a passion he had long suppressed. When she invited the class to share their favorite authors, Zay surprised himself by raising his hand. His voice quivered slightly as he expressed his admiration for James Baldwin, earning an approving nod from Evelyn. After class, Evelyn approached Zay. Impressed by his insight, she encouraged him to consider submitting his work to the college literary magazine. Zay, flushed with pride, stammered his gratitude. This brief exchange sowed the seeds of what would become a perilous obsession for both of them. Over the subsequent weeks, Zay became a regular fixture during Evelyn's office hours. What began as discussions about assignments gradually evolved into profound conversations about literature, life, and Zay's aspirations. Evelyn, recognizing Zay's raw talent and vulnerability, began to subtly mold their interactions. She would lean in closely when reviewing his work, her perfume lingering in the air. Her feedback was a careful blend of praise and criticism, designed to keep Zay constantly seeking her approval. She shared personal anecdotes, creating an illusion of intimacy that blurred the boundaries of the student-teacher relationship. Zay's classmate Amelia later told investigators, "We all noticed how Dr. Gosling treated Zay differently. At first we were just jealous of the attention, but looking back there was something off about it." As midterms approached, Zay struggled in his other classes. The pressure to maintain his scholarship weighed heavily on him. Sensing his distress, Evelyn made her first overt move. After an exceptionally long office meeting, she placed her hand on Zay's arm and spoke softly. "I see so much potential in you, Zay. I'd hate to see it go to waste because of a few challenging classes. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement to ensure your success." Naive and desperate to prove himself, Zay failed to recognize the dangerous ground he was treading. He interpreted Evelyn's offer as a lifeline, a chance to focus on his true passion without the fear of losing his scholarship. As autumn painted the Briarcliff campus in hues of gold and red, Evelyn and Zay's relationship intensified. She invited him to exclusive literary events, introducing him to her colleagues as a promising protégé. Zay, intoxicated by this new world of intellectual stimulation and perceived belonging, began to rely on Evelyn for more than just academic guidance. Evelyn, in turn, reveled in Zay's dependence. She meticulously crafted every interaction to deepen his emotional attachment while maintaining plausible deniability to her colleagues. She was merely nurturing a gifted student. To Zay, she became the center of his universe. By the time the fall semester was drawing to a close, the boundary between mentor and student had become irrevocably blurred. Zay's writing, once filled with diverse influences, now mirrored Evelyn's style and preferences. His social circle had shrunk, with more and more of his time devoted to extra study sessions with Dr. Gosling. Neither Zay nor Evelyn fully grasped the dangerous web they were spinning. As the winter break neared, their relationship balanced precariously on the edge of an abyss, poised to descend into depths from which there would be no return. This break marked a pivotal moment in Evelyn and Zay's dynamic. With the campus largely vacant, they found themselves ensnared in a whirlwind of intensifying emotions and blurred boundaries. Under the pretense of offering additional guidance, Evelyn invited Zay to her off-campus residence to discuss his final paper for her class. The evening commenced innocuously, with Evelyn serving tea and engaging Zay in a spirited debate about postmodern literature. However, as the hours passed and inhibitions waned, the atmosphere transformed. Evelyn, her voice lowered to a near whisper, began to share intimate stories of her own struggles as a young academic. She depicted herself as a misunderstood genius, persecuted by envious colleagues and constrained by the rigid structures of academia. Zay, already captivated by Evelyn's intellect, found himself drawn deeper into her world. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who genuinely understood the artist's plight. When Evelyn's hand brushed against his, the electric charge between them was palpable. What transpired next became a point of contention in the subsequent investigation. Evelyn asserted that Zay initiated the kiss, overcome by youthful passion. Zay, in his final statement, maintained that Evelyn had orchestrated the entire evening to this end. Irrespective of who made the first move, that night signaled the commencement of a physical relationship that would have catastrophic repercussions. As the new semester began, Evelyn and Zay's clandestine affair escalated. Secret meetings in her office evolved into long weekends at secluded bed and breakfasts. Evelyn lavished Zay with gifts, rare books, expensive pens, a laptop to replace his outdated model. She framed each gift as an investment in his future as a writer, further binding him to her. Zay's grades, which had been mediocre in his other classes, suddenly soared. Evelyn used her influence to intervene on his behalf with other professors, portraying him as a misunderstood genius who simply needed the right guidance. She promised Zay that with her help, he could secure a spot in a prestigious MFA program, bypassing the usual requirements. However, as Zay's dependence on Evelyn grew, so did his anxiety. The initial thrill of their forbidden romance began to give way to guilt and fear of discovery. His writing, once vibrant and unique, became a pale imitation of Evelyn's style. His few remaining friends noticed his increasing isolation and erratic behavior. Evelyn, sensing Zay's unease, intensified her manipulation. She alternated between lavish praise and cruel criticism, keeping Zay in a constant state of emotional turmoil. She convinced him that their relationship was special, a meeting of twin souls that the ordinary world could never understand. In a particularly chilling move, Evelyn began to insinuate that Zay's success was entirely dependent on her goodwill. During one tense encounter in her office, she casually remarked, "It would be a shame if the ethics board were to investigate the sudden improvement in your grades. They might get the wrong idea about how you've been earning them." The implied threat was clear. Zay, trapped between his ambition and his growing sense of moral unease, began to withdraw into himself. His journal entries from this period, later recovered by investigators, paint a picture of a young man in deep emotional distress. February 15th. I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I've achieved feels tainted, but how can something so wrong feel so necessary? March 3rd. E says she's the only one who truly understands me. Maybe she's right. The thought of losing her terrifies me more than anything. As the Briarcliff campus blossomed with the arrival of spring, the intricate web of deceit and manipulation had grown so dense that Zay could barely recall his life before Evelyn. His family, alarmed by his increasingly sparse communication, planned a surprise visit. Evelyn, fearful of exposure, compelled Zay to reject them, causing a painful estrangement. During this period, Zay began to confide in his roommate, Trevor. Although he did not disclose the full extent of his relationship with Evelyn, he shared enough to deeply concern Trevor. Trevor's worried glances and pointed questions about Zay's connection to Dr. Gosling would later become the thread that began to unravel the entire sordid affair. As the semester drew to a close, the pressure on both Evelyn and Zay escalated. Their relationship, founded on manipulation and false promises, began to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. Neither could have foreseen the violent culmination that lay just around the corner, a tragic end to a romance that should never have begun. The catalyst for the ensuing tragic events came in the form of an ostensibly innocuous email. Dr. Fiona Sullivan, the Dean of Liberal Arts, contacted Evelyn about Zay's remarkable academic transformation, expressing interest in featuring him in a college newsletter. For Evelyn, this well-intentioned inquiry triggered alarm bells. The prospect of increased scrutiny on Zay's achievements filled her with panic. In a frenzy, Evelyn summoned Zay to her office after hours. The tension was palpable as she paced the room, outlining the danger they faced. Zay, already worn down by months of emotional manipulation, felt the last remnants of his self-worth crumbling. In this charged atmosphere, Zay finally found the courage to confront the reality of their situation. His voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This isn't right, Evelyn. What we're doing is destroying me." Evelyn's reaction was swift and brutal. Her nurturing facade shattered, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. She reminded Zay of all she had done for him, how his success was entirely due to her influence. In a chilling moment, she asked, "Do you really think you'd be anything without me? You're nothing but a small-town boy with delusions of grandeur. I made you, Zay." With his eyes opened to the toxic nature of their relationship, Zay felt a surge of anger and self-preservation. He retorted, "This ends now. I'm going to tell the dean everything." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her carefully constructed world teetered on the brink of collapse. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, she alternated between threats and pleas, reminding Zay of the consequences they would both face if the truth came to light. But something had shifted in Zay. The fog of infatuation and manipulation had lifted, revealing the stark reality of his situation. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, when Evelyn's voice, now ice-cold, stopped him. "If you walk out that door, I'll make sure you never write again." Zay paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, without turning back, he walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with the ruins of her twisted fantasy. The following days were a blur for both Zay and Evelyn. Zay, emboldened by his decision, confided the full extent of the affair to his roommate, Trevor. Together, they decided to approach Dean Sullivan with the truth. Evelyn, meanwhile, spiraled into panic. She alternated between desperate attempts to contact Zay and frantic efforts to cover her tracks. She deleted emails, shredded documents, and called in favors from colleagues to vouch for her character. As Zay prepared to meet with the dean, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Evelyn's threats echoed in his mind, but he was determined to reclaim his life and his integrity. Little did he know that Evelyn, driven to the brink by the imminent exposure of her crimes, was formulating a desperate and deadly plan to silence him forever. On the night of the murder, Zay Holloway left the library just after midnight, his mind preoccupied with the meeting he had scheduled with Dean Sullivan the following morning. As he walked along the deserted path that skirted the lake, he failed to notice the figure emerging from the shadows behind him. Evelyn Gosling had spent the day in a state of frenzied planning. Her rational mind had been overwhelmed by a toxic mix of fear, rage, and desperation. In her distorted reality, silencing Zay had become the only way to preserve the life she had built. She had waited for hours, watching the library entrance, a large rock clutched in her trembling hands. As Zay neared a secluded curve in the path, Evelyn sprang into action. The initial strike caught Zay off guard, sending him staggering forward. He turned, his face etched with shock and betrayal as he recognized his assailant. "Evelyn, I trusted you," he gasped. But Evelyn was beyond reason. With a strength fueled by desperation, she struck him repeatedly while he lay on the ground. Zay's attempts to defend himself were weakened by his reluctance to harm the woman he had once admired and loved. In the aftermath of her brutal act, Evelyn stood frozen, the reality of her deed crashing over her. The fog seemed to envelop her, muffling the sound of Zay's body as it slid down the embankment into the dark waters of the lake. With mechanical efficiency, Evelyn began to cover her tracks. She gathered Zay's scattered belongings, wiping them clean of fingerprints before tossing them into the water. She scoured the area for any evidence that might link her to the scene. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the mist, Evelyn made her way back to her apartment, her clothes sodden and muddied. Over the following days, Evelyn attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught her classes, attended faculty meetings, all while battling the internal turmoil of her guilt and fear. When Zay was reported missing, she feigned concern, even joining search parties organized by the college. But the weight of her actions took its toll. Colleagues noted her distracted demeanor and uncharacteristic nervousness. A psychology professor who had known Evelyn for years later recalled, "There was a wildness in her eyes, a tension in her movements. It was as if she was constantly on the verge of flight." Evelyn's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel almost immediately. The rock she had used as a weapon, hastily discarded in a dumpster behind her apartment building, was discovered by a maintenance worker. Security camera footage placed her car near the lake on the night of Zay's disappearance, contradicting her claim of being home all night. As the investigation intensified, Evelyn's paranoia reached new heights. She became convinced that everyone knew her secret. In a moment of panic, she attempted to flee, hastily packing a bag and withdrawing large sums of cash from her bank account. It was this erratic behavior that ultimately led to her undoing. Zay's body, weighed down by rocks, was discovered by a group of students on a weekend fishing trip. The grim discovery sent shockwaves through the Briarcliff community and marked the beginning of the end for Evelyn Gosling. The discovery of Zay Holloway's body transformed the missing person case into a full-blown homicide investigation. Detective Samantha Reeves, a veteran of the Briarcliff Police Department, took charge of the case. Her first steps were to secure the crime scene and order a comprehensive forensic analysis of the area surrounding Lake Briarcliff. The autopsy revealed that Zay had died from blunt force trauma to the head, with drowning as a secondary cause of death. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on Zay's arms, indicating he had tried to protect himself from his attacker. As news of the murder spread, the idyllic campus of Briarcliff Community College became a hotbed of speculation and fear. Students whispered in hallways, casting suspicious glances at their peers and professors. The administration, desperate to control the narrative, held conferences assuring parents and the community that this was an isolated incident. Detective Reeves and her team embarked on the meticulous process of interviewing Zay's friends, family, and associates. During these initial interviews, Zay's roommate, Trevor Lawson, provided the first crucial lead. Trevor disclosed Zay's troubled relationship with Professor Gosling, including vague references to an arrangement that had left Zay increasingly distressed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. This information prompted investigators to scrutinize Evelyn Gosling more closely. On the surface, Evelyn appeared to be a grieving mentor, distraught over the loss of a promising student. However, as detectives delved deeper, inconsistencies in her story began to surface. A breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered traces of soil on the rock used to attack Zay that matched samples from Evelyn's garden. Additionally, security footage from a gas station near Lake Briarcliff showed Evelyn's car in the area on the night of the murder, contradicting her alibi. As the evidence accumulated, Evelyn's colleagues began to come forward with their own observations. A professor from the psychology department recalled a disturbing conversation with Evelyn just days before Zay's disappearance. She seemed agitated, he told investigators. She kept talking about how she couldn't let everything she'd worked for be destroyed by a misunderstanding. The investigation took another turn when detectives uncovered a series of emails between Evelyn and Zay. While carefully worded, the subtext of these messages hinted at an inappropriate relationship. IT specialists recovered deleted drafts of emails from Evelyn's college account that were far more explicit, detailing her manipulation of Zay and her fears of exposure. The search of Evelyn's apartment yielded damning evidence. Hidden in a locked drawer, detectives found Zay's journal, which detailed the evolution of their relationship and his growing desire to end it. With the wealth of physical evidence and witness testimony, the district attorney's office felt confident in charging Evelyn Gosling with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the image of the brilliant, dedicated professor and exposing the dark underbelly of power dynamics in academia. As Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, the true scope of her deception began to unravel, leaving the Briarcliff community to grapple with the question of how such a predator had hidden in plain sight for so long. Over the next several hours, Evelyn's full confession emerged, painting a disturbing picture of manipulation, abuse of power, and ultimately, murder. She spoke of her initial attraction to Zay's talent and vulnerability, how easy it had been to shape him to her will. Her voice filled with bitterness as she recounted Zay's decision to expose their relationship, describing it as a betrayal that left her no option but to silence him permanently. The trial of Evelyn Gosling was brief but intense. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from forensic analysis to Evelyn's own confession. Despite a vigorous defense attempting to portray her as a victim of her own mental illness, the jury took only 6 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment, sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath of the trial, significant changes were implemented at Briarcliff Community College. The administration instituted strict new guidelines governing faculty-student interactions, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior was established. As Briarcliff slowly began to heal, the tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The shores of Lake Briarcliff, once a place of tranquility and reflection, now stood as a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades and the tragic consequences when trust is abused and power is unchecked.